Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the shortest, strangest wars in modern history. Imagine two neighbors so fed up with each other that a few soccer matches are all it takes to spark an actual shooting war. That's right, we're talking about the Football War of 1969, when Honduras and El Salvador went from rivals on the field to enemies on the battlefield in the span of a few days. On one side, you've got Honduras, a country with plenty of land but not enough development or infrastructure to keep everyone happy. On the other, El Salvador smaller, more densely populated, and struggling with a growing population that had been spilling over the border for decades. Tensions were already high over land disputes and migration policies when, just to spice things up, the two nations' national soccer teams faced off during the World Cup qualifiers. The matches quickly turned ugly, and not just on the pitch. National pride mixed with anger, and soon riots were breaking out. Newspapers stoked the flames. Politicians saw opportunities to distract from their own failings. And by the time the final game was played, both governments were acting like it was a matter of life and death. Over the course of just 4 days, roughly 2,000 people would die, tens of thousands would be displaced, and a fragile peace between the two nations would collapse. It's a war so bizarre that it makes you wonder how humanity has managed to survive this long. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Did you know about this battle before? If not, drop a comment after you hear how it really went down. Ready, let's drop into tonight's story. Things are about to get weird. It all started with what should have been just another World Cup qualifier. The first match took place in Tegucigalpa, the Honduran capital, where tensions were already simmering. Salvadoran players arrived to a less than warm welcome, with fans making sure their hotel stay was as sleepless and miserable as possible. Think fireworks, car horns, and the occasional rock thrown through a window. By the time the players took the field, they were more than ready to unleash their frustration. Honduras won the game 1-0, which might not sound like a big deal, but it was enough to spark riots. Salvadoran fans smashed windows, Honduran fans retaliated, and suddenly everyone was convinced this wasn't just about soccer anymore. Back in San Salvador, newspapers reported the loss like it was a national humiliation, with headlines that basically screamed, "Our honor has been trampled, the government," sensing an opportunity, leaned into the outrage. The second match, held in San Salvador, was even more intense. This time, it was the Honduran players' turn to suffer a night of relentless harassment. When they hit the field, they were greeted by jeers, insults, and a stadium packed with fans who seemed ready to declare war right then and there. El Salvador won decisively, 3-0, and the celebrations quickly spiraled out of control. Honduran flags were burned. Violence broke out in the streets, and hundreds of Honduran migrants living in El Salvador suddenly found themselves targets of mob attacks. While all this was happening, politicians on both sides were fanning the flames. In Honduras, leaders blamed Salvadoran immigrants for taking jobs and land. In El Salvador, leaders accused Honduras of mistreating their people. It was a perfect storm of nationalism, resentment, and political opportunism. And then came the third and final match, played in Mexico as a neutral site. This game was supposed to calm things down. Instead, it was like tossing gasoline on a bonfire. El Salvador won again, 3-2, and within hours, the Salvadoran government broke off diplomatic relations with Honduras. Military units began to mobilize. Soldiers were ordered to the border. And the world got to watch in disbelief as a soccer rivalry turned into an actual shooting war. Historians still argue over whether the matches themselves were the spark or just a convenient excuse for a conflict that had been building for years. Most agree the deeper issue was land. El Salvador was overcrowded, and many of its citizens had been moving into Honduras in search of farmland. When Honduras passed new land reforms that favored its own citizens and started evicting Salvadoran migrants, the stage was set for violence. By July 14, 1969, everything was in place for disaster. El Salvador's leaders saw war as a way to distract from internal problems and rally the nation. Honduras's leaders were equally stubborn, determined not to be bullied. And when the Salvadoran Air Force launched a surprise attack on Honduran airfields that morning, there was no turning back. As bizarre as it sounds, this wasn't even the first time soccer had caused political chaos. There are stories from ancient Greece about city-states going to war over athletic contests, though none quite as literal as this one. But in the modern era, the football war remains one of the clearest and weirdest examples of how sports and politics can collide in spectacularly stupid ways. In the next part of our story, we'll see how those first shots spiraled into a full-blown invasion, complete with tanks, old fighter planes, and a lot of very confused villagers wondering how their local soccer team got them into this mess. If you thought things were already bad after the third soccer match, well, welcome to the pre-game warm-up before an actual war. The final whistle had barely blown before both governments went from angry neighbors yelling over the fence to armed lunatics charging through the garden with machetes. See, the soccer games were the flashy spark everyone noticed, but the real dynamite was buried in the ground literally. The land dispute between Honduras and El Salvador had been simmering for decades. El Salvador was tiny but packed with people, like trying to fit a family of 12 into a one-bedroom apartment. Honduras, by contrast, had plenty of space, but a lot of that land was owned by wealthy elites or companies like the United Fruit Company. Most of it wasn't exactly available for new settlers. For years, Salvadorans had been quietly crossing the border, setting up farms and villages in Honduras. Some estimates say over 300,000 Salvadorans were living there by the late 1960s, and they weren't just passing through, they were planting roots, building homes, and in many cases, being more productive than the locals. And while ordinary Hondurans weren't thrilled about this competition, their government didn't do much about it until the 1960s, when land reform became the hot political trend. Honduran politicians suddenly announced they were going to redistribute land to Hondurans only. This was not great news for Salvadoran migrants, who were now being kicked off their farms and, in some cases, attacked by mobs. The Salvadoran government protested loudly, claiming their people were being mistreated. Honduras responded with a shrug and maybe a little side-eye, like, "Your people, they're our problem now." By the time the soccer matches came around, you had decades of resentment, thousands of displaced families, and two governments desperate to distract their citizens from, actual problems like poverty and corruption. Nothing unites a country quite like an external enemy or, apparently, a bad referee call during a World Cup qualifier. After El Salvador broke diplomatic ties, things escalated at lightning speed in Honduran towns near the border. Salvadoran families fled in panic, some of them literally carrying chickens under their arms as they ran. One Honduran farmer was overheard shouting, "This isn't about soccer, this is about my land," while his neighbor yelled back, "It's both. You fool." Even the local radio stations were pouring gasoline on the fire. One Salvadoran announcer dramatically declared, "Our nation's dignity is at stake," which, let's be honest, is the kind of phrase you expect before a duel, not an international war. Meanwhile, the militaries were quietly getting ready. Honduras' army was larger on paper, but much of its equipment was outdated. El Salvador's military was smaller but scrappier, with officers who'd been itching for a fight, and neither side was exactly ready for modern warfare, but both were convinced they could handle the other. It was like watching two guys in a bar, both out of shape, both very drunk, insisting they could totally take you, bro. Historians still debate whether the leaders actually wanted a full-scale war or just thought a little saber-rattling would earn them political points. Some argue El Salvador genuinely believed a quick, decisive strike would scare Honduras into negotiating. Others think Honduran leaders were banking on international intervention before things got too bloody. Whatever the plan was, nobody told the soldiers on the ground, who were soon caught in a mess they didn't entirely understand. And then there was the role of the press. Newspapers in both countries treated every minor incident like a declaration of Armageddon. One Salvadoran paper printed a story about Honduran mobs chasing Salvadoran families with machetes, complete with lurid descriptions and quotes that may or may not have been entirely true. Honduran papers fired back with stories about Salvadoran invaders stealing land and livestock. It was less journalism and more like two tabloids competing for the title of most likely to start a war. On July 13th, the day before the war officially began, you could feel the tension buzzing in the air. Salvadoran troops were massing near the border, and Honduran villages were in chaos. In some towns, local priests tried to calm people down with sermons about peace and brotherhood. In others, they were busy blessing soldiers' rifles. The whole situation was like a fever dream half-religious festival, half-doomsday prep. By sunset, both sides were locked and loaded. El Salvador's leaders held tense meetings in the capital, whispering about strategies and maps. Honduras scrambled to move what few fighter planes they had to safer locations. That night, families huddled in their homes, listening to radios that crackled with rumors. Some swore they heard the sound of planes overhead. Others claimed there were spies in their town. It was like a ghost story, except the monsters were real and carried rifles. And then, in the early hours of July 14th, El Salvador decided to strike first. Their air force roared into action, launching surprise raids on Honduran airfields. In a twist of historical comedy, many of the planes were relics from World War II, purchased secondhand and held together with more duct tape than anyone would like to admit. Honduran pilots scrambled to defend their runways, leaping into equally ancient planes. The first bombs fell near Tegucigalpa, waking the city with an explosion that rattled windows for miles. Honduran radio announcers scrambled to make sense of it. One famously blurted out, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are under attack. Please, stay calm and maybe take cover." Not exactly the most inspiring battle cry, but hey, he was improvising. On the ground, soldiers rushed to their positions. Farmers grabbed rifles they hadn't fired in years. Villagers debated whether to flee or stay put. And somewhere, far from the chaos, a soccer fan probably muttered, "I just wanted to watch the game." The football war had officially begun. The morning of July 14th, 1969 was pure chaos. Imagine waking up to the sound of propeller-driven warplanes buzzing overhead, only to realize those planes look like they belong in a black and white documentary about World War II. That's because, well, they basically did. El Salvador and Honduras weren't exactly rolling in cutting-edge military tech. Their air forces were flying relics like P-51 Mustangs and F-4U Corsairs planes that had probably seen action against Nazis and kamikaze pilots 2 decades earlier. It was like showing up to a modern Formula One race in a horse-drawn carriage and saying, "Yeah, we've got this." The Salvadoran strategy was simple: hit Honduran airfields fast, disable their ability to fight back, and pave the way for a ground invasion. In theory, this was a clever move. In practice, it was like trying to knock out your opponent's teeth by throwing bricks at their face while blindfolded. Some bombs hit their targets, others missed completely, landing in fields, rivers, or in one particularly embarrassing case, an empty soccer stadium. Still, the element of surprise worked. Honduran pilots scrambled to their planes as bombs fell around them. One pilot later claimed he was still in his pajamas when he took off, which must have been one heck of a fashion statement. Another joke that the real battle was figuring out which levers in his cockpit still worked. By mid-morning, Honduras had managed to get several planes airborne and began dogfighting with the Salvadorans. If you've ever watched Too Old, rusty cars trying to ram each other in a demolition derby, you've got a pretty good idea of what these aerial battles looked like. Pilots looped, dived, and spun through the sky, with maneuvers that were equal parts skill and sheer desperation. Meanwhile, on the ground, Salvadoran troops began crossing the border. They poured into towns and villages, many of which were barely defended. The first hours of the invasion were marked by confusion more than resistance. Some Honduran villagers mistook the Salvadoran soldiers for their own troops at first, only realizing the truth when someone shouted in a different accent. Imagine how awkward that must have been. "Welcome, boys, glad you're here to help defend the town. Actually, we're here to capture it." "Oh, well, darn." The Salvadoran army advanced quickly, taking control of several key towns and roadways. Their early momentum was impressive, at least until they started running into logistical problems. See, El Salvador didn't exactly have a modern supply chain. Soldiers were sometimes marching ahead of their own fuel trucks, which meant that tanks and vehicles would stall out in the middle of nowhere. In one recorded incident, Salvadoran soldiers literally pushed a stalled jeep up a hill while muttering curses about their generals. Honduran forces, though initially caught off guard, began regrouping. Small units dug in along highways and bridges, determined to slow the Salvadoran advance. Fighting broke out in jungles, fields, and towns, often at close range. The first real bloodshed of the war was both brutal and bewildering. For many soldiers, this was their first time in combat. Some had been drafted only weeks before, plucked from farms and factories, handed a rifle, and told, "Good luck out there." As the day wore on, reports of atrocities started trickling in. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Salvadoran families living in Honduras faced violent reprisals from angry mobs and rogue soldiers. Honduran refugees fled in the opposite direction, fearing retaliation from Salvadoran troops. The border became a chaotic human tide, with thousands of people moving in both directions, carrying whatever they could on their backs. In the Salvadoran capital, the government framed the invasion as a heroic crusade. Radio broadcasts were filled with triumphant music and speeches about reclaiming dignity and defending national honor. It sounded glorious if you ignored the fact that most of the troops were exhausted, underfed, and rapidly running out of ammunition. One bizarre piece of trivia during this first day of combat: a Salvadoran pilot reportedly used a hand grenade to blow up an enemy plane. He flew low, pulled the pin, and tossed it into the open cockpit of a parked Honduran aircraft. Historians still debate whether this actually happened, or whether it's just a wartime tall tale. Either way, it's the kind of story that perfectly captures the strange improvisation of this war. By nightfall, El Salvador had made significant gains, but the cost was already high. Casualties were mounting, and the front lines were a chaotic mess. Soldiers were often unsure of where they were or which towns were under whose control. In some cases, units accidentally fired on their own allies. One Salvadoran officer supposedly shouted, "Stop shooting, you idiots!" We're on the same side, only to be answered by a bewildered Honduran soldier yelling, "No, we're not." Back in Honduras, the government was in full panic mode. President Oswaldo López Arellano ordered a general mobilization, calling up reserves and scrambling to defend key cities. Civilians were told to prepare for possible attacks. In Tegucigalpa, citizens dug trenches in their neighborhoods while children were evacuated to safer areas. It was a scene straight out of a disaster movie, if that movie was low budget and everyone was speaking Spanish really, really fast. Internationally, the reaction was one of stunned disbelief. News outlets around the world scrambled to explain how a World Cup qualifier had escalated into a full-blown war. Headlines were dramatic soccer sparks shooting war, neighbors clash over football and farms, and my personal favorite, goal El Salvador scores early in surprise attack. You can almost hear the editors cackling as they wrote that one. As night fell on July 14th, both sides were preparing for another round of violence. Salvadoran troops dug trenches and fortified their positions. Honduran units prepared counterattacks. And somewhere in the darkness, a soldier stared at the stars and wondered how in the world he'd ended up fighting over a game he probably hadn't even watched. Historians still argue about whether El Salvador's initial success could have led to a quick victory if they'd pressed harder. Some say they simply lacked the resources to finish the job. Others believe international pressure would have forced them to stop no matter what. Whatever the truth, the stage was set for a chaotic, unpredictable second day of fighting, one that would test both nations to their limits. Dawn on July 15th came with a roar of engines and a fresh round of gunfire. After a full day of Salvadoran advances, Honduras was ready to hit back, and they weren't about to do it quietly. The night had been filled with frantic activity, reinforcements arriving, hastily built barricades going up, and commanders shouting orders over the constant whine of radios. By sunrise, the border region had transformed into a battlefield. El Salvador, thinking they had the upper hand after their initial strike, planned to push deeper into Honduran territory. Their troops were tired but motivated, buoyed by early victories and government propaganda promising a quick win. In the Salvadoran capital, radio stations blasted patriotic songs and victory speeches, urging the nation to stand proud and defend the homeland. It sounded glorious if you ignored the fact that a lot of soldiers were running on little more than stale tortillas and adrenaline. Honduras, on the other hand, was furious. Their airfields may have been hit hard, but their spirit wasn't broken. Overnight, they had scrambled pilots, repaired damaged runways, and brought ancient fighter planes roaring back to life. Some of these planes these scenes were so old, they looked like they belonged in a museum. One mechanic reportedly fixed a wing with sheet metal ripped from an old pickup truck. When asked if it would fly, he shrugged and said, "It only has to fly once." By mid-morning, Honduran pilots were airborne, ready to strike back. What followed were some of the strangest dogfights in modern history. Imagine two old veterans reenacting their glory days, except this time with real bullets. P-51 Mustangs swooped through the skies, banking and diving like scenes from a 1940s war movie. At one point, two pilots passed so close to each other that witnesses swore they could see the whites of the other man's eyes. Meanwhile, on the ground, Salvadoran troops were making progress but at a high cost. Fighting in towns and villages turned brutal and chaotic. Houses were riddled with bullets, livestock ran loose through the streets, and civilians fled with whatever they could carry. The Salvadoran army took control of several key roads, but their supply lines were stretched thin. Trucks ran out of gas miles from the front. Soldiers resorted to commandeering bicycles, donkeys, and in one recorded instance, a flatbed truck normally used to transport bananas. Honduran resistance stiffened as the day went on. Fresh units arrived from the interior, bringing new rifles and heavier weapons. In one clash near the town of Nueva Ocotepeque, Salvadoran forces found themselves pinned down by well-placed Honduran machine guns. After hours of fighting, the Salvadorans retreated, leaving behind a trail of burned-out vehicles and spent ammunition. One particularly bizarre incident occurred when a group of Salvadoran soldiers stormed what they thought was a Honduran command post. Instead, they burst into a wedding reception. The bride screamed, the groom dove under a table, and a very confused sergeant apologized awkwardly before realizing he was in the wrong village entirely. Later, that same sergeant supposedly remarked, "At least the cake looked good." While these local battles raged, both governments were engaged in a second war, this one fought over radio waves and international opinion. Salvadoran broadcasters claimed their troops were liberating oppressed Salvadorans living in Honduras. Honduran radio responded by labeling the Salvadorans as invaders and traitors. Around the world, foreign journalists struggled to explain the situation to bewildered audiences. Newspapers ran headlines like, "Soccer war escalates," and "When football fans attack." International organizations began to take notice. The Organization of American States, or OAS, was particularly alarmed. Diplomats gathered in Washington, D.C. debating how to stop the bloodshed. In one meeting, a representative reportedly muttered, "We're about to mediate a war over a ball." While everyone laughed nervously, no one could ignore the seriousness of the conflict. Historians still debate whether El Salvador's leaders believed they could actually win a decisive victory. Some argue they were banking on speed strike hard, force Honduras to the negotiating table and secure better treatment for Salvadoran migrants. Others believe the invasion was more about pride than strategy, a way to show the world that El Salvador would not be pushed around. Whatever the case, by the evening of July 15th, it was clear this wasn't going to be the quick, clean war they'd hoped for. As night fell, Salvadoran soldiers dug trenches and prepared for the next day. The once quiet border towns were now filled with the sounds of hammers, shovels, and whispered prayers. In Tegucigalpa, citizens braced for more air raids. Families huddled in candlelit rooms while children asked questions no parent could answer. Somewhere in the darkness, two rival sentries stood on opposite sides of a field, both exhausted, both homesick, and both wondering why they were risking their lives over something that had started with a game. And so, the football war entered its second day not as a brief clash, but as a full-scale conflict spiraling out of control. The question now wasn't who would score the next goal, it was who could survive the next 24 hours. July 16th dawned with an uneasy quiet. Birds chirped nervously over fields that had been pounded by artillery the day before. For a brief moment, it almost felt like peace if you ignored the columns of smoke spiraling up from burning villages and the distant rumble of engines. That calm didn't last long. At 6:00 a.m., El Salvador launched another wave of attacks. Determined to press their advantage, soldiers who had barely slept stumbled into position, rubbing their eyes and muttering curses about their commanders. Their orders were simple: keep moving forward. The Salvadoran government wanted to capture as much territory as possible before international pressure forced them to stop. On the ground, it was a messy, grueling fight. Salvadoran infantry clashed with Honduran defenders along highways, rivers, and the edges of small towns. In some places, the fighting was so close that soldiers could hear each other shouting orders. In others, they were separated by miles of jungle, exchanging sporadic bursts of gunfire that hit more trees than enemies. Civilians were caught in the middle. Entire families fled their homes, carrying whatever they could grab. Chickens, goats, and even pet dogs were dragged along in a chaotic exodus. One witness recalled seeing a man carrying a huge radio on his back while his wife carried a baby in one arm and a sack of corn in the other. "We didn't know where to go," he said later. "We just knew we had to get away from the noise." By mid-morning, Salvadoran forces had advanced several miles deeper into Honduras, seizing more towns and key roads. But these victories were fragile. Their supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. Trucks were breaking down. Fuel was running low and food was scarce. Some soldiers went 2 days without a proper meal. One Salvadoran unit reportedly survived on a diet of bananas, stale tortillas, and questionable river water. Honduran troops, meanwhile, were regrouping. Reinforcements from the interior began arriving at the front, bringing heavier weapons and much-needed morale. In one memorable clash, a group of Honduran soldiers held off a Salvadoran assault by cleverly using overturned buses as barricades. They even painted the buses with slogans like "Not Today, Salvador," which probably confused the enemy as much as it inspired the defenders. The skies above were alive with activity. Honduran planes, patched together overnight, began launching counterattacks on Salvadoran positions. Pilots swooped low over enemy lines, dropping bombs that were sometimes improvised from old naval shells. One particularly daring pilot allegedly strafed a Salvadoran column while humming a popular ranchera tune over his radio. These aerial battles were surreal. By modern standards, they were laughably outdated planes from the 1940s dueling in a war fought in 1969. Historians often compare it to watching two knights joust in the middle of a Formula One race. But outdated or not, the planes were deadly. Salvadoran troops quickly learned to dive for cover at the first hint of an engine roar. Amid the chaos, bizarre moments still managed to shine through. In one village, Salvadoran troops stormed into a church, expecting to find Honduran soldiers hiding inside. Instead, they interrupted a group of terrified townspeople holding an emergency prayer service. The priest, thinking quickly, offered to bless the Salvadoran rifles. The soldiers accepted, then marched back out, leaving the villagers bewildered but unharmed. Back in the capitals, the propaganda war raged just as fiercely as the actual fighting. Salvadoran radio stations blasted victory announcements, claiming their forces were liberating the oppressed. Honduran broadcasts painted the Salvadorans as villains bent on destruction. Listeners in neutral countries probably couldn't tell which side was winning or if anyone was. The international community was growing alarmed. The Organization of American States convened emergency meetings, trying to figure out how to stop the conflict before it spiraled further out of control. Diplomats debated sanctions, peacekeeping forces, and ceasefire proposals. At one particularly tense session, a delegate reportedly muttered, "Are we really about to negotiate peace over a soccer game? It would have been funny if the stakes weren't so high." Historians still argue about whether El Salvador could have pushed all the way to Tegucigalpa if they'd kept advancing. Some believe their momentum was unstoppable at least for a few more days. Others point to their dwindling supplies and say a total victory was never realistic. What's clear is that, by the end of July 16th, El Salvador's army was beginning to slow down. That evening, Honduran forces launched a series of counterattacks. These weren't massive, coordinated strikes. They were smaller, desperate pushes aimed at disrupting Salvadoran lines and reclaiming lost ground. In some places, the counterattacks worked brilliantly. In others, they collapsed in confusion. A radio operator later described the night's fighting as like trying to herd cats with grenades. As darkness fell, both sides were exhausted. Soldiers lay in trenches, staring up at a sky filled with smoke and stars. Some prayed, others cursed, and somewhere out there, a Salvadoran private probably muttered. This all started because of a stupid soccer game, before drifting into a fitful sleep. By the end of the second full day of fighting, casualties were already climbing into the thousands. Entire villages were deserted. The borderlands were a shattered landscape of burned-out buildings and broken lives. And yet, neither side showed any sign of backing down. The world was watching, waiting, and wondering how much longer could this madness go on before someone stepped in to blow the final whistle. By July 17th, the war was reaching a fever pitch. After 2 full days of clashes, both sides were bloodied, exhausted, and starting to realize this wasn't going to be the quick, decisive fight they'd imagined. The Salvadoran government still insisted victory was within reach, while Honduran leaders vowed they would never surrender an inch of territory. And stuck in the middle tens of thousands of civilians, wondering how a soccer match had turned their world upside down. That morning, the Organization of American States finally stepped off the sidelines. The OAS was like the exasperated referee in a game where both teams had been ignoring every whistle. Its diplomats gathered in emergency meetings, frantically drafting proposals and calling both governments in a desperate attempt to broker peace. But here's the thing, neither El Salvador nor Honduras was particularly interested in listening. The Salvadoran leadership believed they still had the upper hand. They wanted to keep pressing their offensive until Honduras agreed to meet their demands. Meanwhile, Honduras, though battered, saw international attention as a chance to rally sympathy. If they could hold out a little longer, maybe they'd get foreign support or at least pressure on El Salvador to back down. While the diplomats talked, the soldiers kept fighting. Honduran forces launched a counterattack, retaking several villages and pushing Salvadoran units back across key roads. The Salvadorans, in turn, dug in and fought fiercely for every hill and bridge. In some cases, the same patch of ground changed hands 3 or 4 times in a single day. The air war was especially intense. Honduran pilots, flying those patched up WWII relics, became national heroes overnight. Newspapers ran headlines like, "Our brave Hawks strike back one pilot, Captain Fernando Soto Henriquez, famously shot down 3 Salvadoran planes in a single day, becoming the last known ace of the piston engine era." To this day, aviation buffs still debate the exact details of those dogfights. On the Salvadoran side, pilots were just as determined. Some missions involved flying so low over enemy positions that villagers swore they could feel the plane's exhaust on their faces. A few even dropped improvised bombs made from barrels filled with explosives. It was deadly, yes, but also wildly dangerous. One Salvadoran pilot later admitted he didn't know if the barrel bombs would explode or just bounce like giant tin cans. While the skies roared with battle, the ground war took a grim turn. Civilians were increasingly targeted, either deliberately or through sheer chaos. Salvadoran families living in Honduras faced brutal reprisals. Mobs attacked homes, burning them to the ground and chasing terrified families into the countryside. In El Salvador, Honduran migrants faced similar violence. Entire communities fled, creating a massive refugee crisis almost overnight. One strange moment of humanity came when a Honduran and a Salvadoran unit accidentally stumbled into each other during a nighttime patrol. Instead of immediately shooting, both sides froze. Then, according to one account, a Salvadoran soldier whispered, "I don't even like soccer," and a few nervous laughs broke out. The tension shattered, and both groups retreated in opposite directions without a shot being fired. Back at the OAS headquarters, negotiations were going nowhere fast. The Salvadoran delegation insisted that Honduras must stop mistreating Salvadoran migrants and agreed to new land policies. The Hondurans countered by demanding an immediate withdrawal of Salvadoran troops. At one point, an exasperated diplomat reportedly slammed his folder on the table and shouted, "Gentlemen, this is not how you run a soccer match or a war." International media descended on the region, hungry for updates. Foreign correspondents reported live from chaotic border towns, dodging stray bullets while trying to interview refugees. The rest of the world was baffled in Europe and the United States. Commentators kept asking the same question, is this really about soccer? The answer, of course, was complicated. Historians still debate how much of the conflict was genuinely about the matches and how much was just decades of unresolved issues boiling over. Some argue the soccer games were merely the trigger. Others believe the intense nationalism surrounding the World Cup qualifiers gave both governments the perfect excuse to rally their citizens for war. By evening, the OAS finally announced a proposed ceasefire. The deal called for an immediate halt to hostilities and the beginning of peace talks, but convincing the actual soldiers on the ground was another matter entirely. Many of them hadn't even heard of the ceasefire, let alone understood what it meant. As night fell, the fighting raged on. Salvadoran artillery pounded Honduran positions. Honduran infantry counterattacked under cover of darkness. And through it all, villagers huddled in basements and churches, praying for dawn. In the Salvadoran capital, government officials toasted their victories. Even as casualty reports poured in Tegucigalpa, Honduran leaders vowed to fight to the last man. It was clear that the OAS would need more than diplomatic words to stop this runaway war. And somewhere out there, in a ruined stadium near the border, a lonely soccer ball lay half buried in the dirt, a silent reminder of how it had all begun. By the morning of July 18th, the football war had fully transformed into a fever dream of chaos. What had started as a fast-moving invasion now resembled a bizarre tug-of-war, with both sides scrambling to claim small victories while the world looked on in bewilderment. The skies were especially wild that day. Honduran and Salvadoran pilots dueled over the border in some of the strangest aerial combat scenes of the 20th century. Imagine a modern battlefield, and now swap out jets for prop-driven relics from World War II. It was like watching a high-stakes air show where nobody bothered to bring new equipment. Honduran ace Fernando Soto Henriquez once again made headlines by shooting down another Salvadoran plane. By the end of the war, he would become a national hero and the last known flying ace of piston engine combat, a title that sounds impressive but also very, very outdated. On the ground, the Salvadoran advance was slowing. Their initial momentum had been impressive, but now they were bogged down by stretched supply lines and fierce Honduran resistance. Ammunition was running low. Fuel shortages meant that Salvadoran tanks and trucks were sometimes abandoned mid-battle. In one surreal incident, soldiers used captured Honduran school buses to ferry troops to the front lines. Picture that, a line of brightly painted buses rattling down a war-torn road, packed with armed men singing battle songs off-key. Honduras was beginning to regroup. Reinforcements poured in from the interior, bringing new rifles, heavier weapons, and a badly needed boost in morale. Many of these soldiers were poorly trained, but their sheer numbers and determination made a difference. Fighting was especially brutal near key highways and river crossings. Salvadoran troops dug in, but the Hondurans fought like men defending their homes, which, in many cases, they were for civilians. Life had descended into a nightmare. Entire towns were abandoned as families fled through jungles and fields, carrying whatever they could. Many Salvadoran families living in Honduras were forced to flee back across the border. At the same time, Honduran villagers fled in the opposite direction, terrified of Salvadoran reprisals. The result was a massive, chaotic human migration. One United Nations report later estimated that more than 300,000 people were displaced in just a few days. In the midst of this chaos, bizarre moments of comedy still surfaced. In one small village, a Salvadoran platoon captured a Honduran position only to discover that their prisoners included a very confused cow. The animal had somehow wandered into the trench during the fighting. Soldiers, unsure what to do, decided to name her La Neutral and keep her as a mascot until they were forced to retreat later that day. While soldiers were dealing with mascots and missing supplies, the Organization of American States was intensifying its efforts to mediate. Diplomatic teams worked around the clock, shuttling messages between the two capitals. They even floated a proposal for a ceasefire to begin within 24 hours. The Honduran government agreed immediately, eager to stop the destruction. El Salvador, however, hesitated. Their generals believed they still had a chance to win, or at least to occupy enough territory to strengthen their negotiating position. Historians still debate this decision. Some argue El Salvador's hesitation cost them dearly, both militarily and diplomatically. Others think Honduras would have refused to honor any ceasefire unless it was enforced by outside powers. Whatever the case, the fighting continued throughout the day and into the night. The air battles reached new heights of absurdity. Both sides were running out of conventional bombs, so they began improvising. Salvadoran pilots reportedly dropped barrels filled with dynamite, while Honduran pilots retaliated with homemade napalm concoctions. These makeshift weapons were wildly inaccurate, often missing their targets completely. One Salvadoran officer later quipped, "I think we scared more goats than soldiers with those bombs." On the diplomatic front, international media coverage was ramping up. Reporters from Europe and North America arrived in the region, filing stories with headlines like, "The War That Soccer Built and World Cup of Carnage." Television footage of burned-out villages and desperate refugees shocked audiences around the globe. Governments that had initially dismissed the conflict as a minor border dispute were now under pressure to take action. By late evening, the Salvadoran leadership began to realize they were running out of time. Their troops were exhausted, their supplies nearly depleted, and the international community was closing in. OAS diplomats warned that if El Salvador refused to accept a ceasefire, they risked becoming global pariahs. Still, on the battlefield, the fighting showed no signs of stopping. In some places, battles raged into the early hours of July 19th. Soldiers fought in near total darkness, guided only by the muzzle flashes of their rifles and the occasional flare. One Honduran veteran later described it as a night where the stars themselves seemed to be shooting at us. By dawn, the front lines had barely shifted. Both armies were battered and bloodied. The Salvadoran dream of a quick, decisive victory was fading fast. Honduras, though still reeling, now had momentum on its side. And hanging over both nations was the looming question of whether peace would come soon or if the madness would continue until there was nothing left to fight over. July 19th arrived like the hangover after a 3-day party, except instead of confetti, there were spent shell casings, burned out buses, and a whole lot of exhausted soldiers trying to remember what day it was. The war was entering its 4th day, and for everyone involved, the adrenaline was starting to wear off, replaced by fatigue, hunger, and a creeping sense of, wait, what exactly are we doing here again? For El Salvador, the situation was slipping from bad to worse. Their early blitz into Honduran territory had stalled completely. Supply lines were collapsing. Soldiers were running out of food and ammo. Some were so desperate that they looted abandoned shops for canned goods, while others bartered cigarettes for tortillas with frightened villagers. A Salvadoran lieutenant later admitted, "We were fighting one war against Honduras and another war against our stomachs." Meanwhile, Honduras was slowly clawing its way back into the fight. Reinforcements were flooding in, many of them poorly trained, but full of anger and patriotism. These fresh troops bolstered defenses and launched small, sharp counterattacks. In one particularly dramatic moment, a group of Honduran soldiers recaptured a strategic bridge by charging across it with bayonets fixed, shouting, for Honduras at the top of their lungs. The bridge changed hands 3 more times that day, like a very violent game of capture the flag. Above the battlefield, the ancient planes kept dueling in the skies. The Honduran ace, Fernando Soto Henriquez, scored another victory, cementing his place in aviation history. His 3rd confirmed kill was a Salvadoran plane attempting a bombing run on a Honduran convoy. Legend has it that when he returned to base, a mechanic greeted him with a salute and a joke. "Congratulations, Captain, you've just upgraded us from World War II to Korea." Salvadoran pilots, for their part, weren't backing down. They were flying dangerously low, sometimes skimming treetops to avoid radar detection. One near-mythical story tells of a Salvadoran pilot who dropped a barrel bomb on a Honduran roadblock, only for the bomb to bounce harmlessly down the road like a giant. Deadly tumbleweed. The Honduran soldiers scattered, unharmed but definitely traumatized. International attention was now at its peak. Reporters were sending vivid dispatches back home, painting a picture of a war that was both tragic and absurd. Newspapers ran front-page photos of burned villages, starving refugees, and those ridiculous WWII planes locked in combat. Evening news anchors struggled to explain how a soccer rivalry had spiraled into this chaos. Some viewers thought it was a joke until the casualty numbers started coming in. By this point, more than 1,000 people had been killed, and tens of thousands were displaced. The refugee situation was becoming a crisis in its own right. Entire families were stranded in no man's land between the two countries, living under makeshift tents and waiting for humanitarian aid that often never arrived. A few international charities managed to send in supplies, but their trucks were sometimes caught in the crossfire or looted by desperate civilians. The Organization of American States was running out of patience. Their diplomats spent the day frantically negotiating with both sides, warning that continued fighting could lead to sanctions or even outside intervention. Behind closed doors, tempers flared. One Honduran delegate reportedly slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "We will not be lectured by the country that started this," a Salvadoran representative shot back, "and we will not be bullied by the ones who forced our people to flee." It was, to put it mildly, not the most productive meeting. On the battlefield, there were still flashes of surreal humor amid the horror. In one village, a group of Salvadoran soldiers stumbled upon a Honduran defensive position that had been abandoned in a hurry. Among the supplies left behind was a radio playing a jaunty folk song. The Salvadorans paused for a moment, then perhaps out of sheer exhaustion started dancing. A few minutes later, fresh Honduran troops arrived, and everyone dove for cover, the music still blaring in the background like the world's weirdest battle soundtrack. By evening, both armies were nearing their breaking point. The Salvadorans, overextended and undersupplied, were retreating from several key positions. Honduran units were too tired to pursue aggressively. In many places, the fighting slowed to sporadic sniper fire and occasional skirmishes. That night, the OAS announced a breakthrough. Both governments had agreed, at least on paper, to a ceasefire set to begin within 24 hours. In theory, the war was almost over. In practice, it wasn't that simple. The problem was communication. Many frontline units didn't get the message. Others simply didn't believe it. One Salvadoran soldier later recalled, "Our officer told us there was a ceasefire, but then we got shot at 5 minutes later, so we figured it was a trick." And so, even as diplomats congratulated themselves in Washington, the war raged on through the night. Soldiers fought on hillsides lit by burning buildings. Refugees huddled in ditches, unsure which way to run. Somewhere, a Honduran private probably muttered, "I hate soccer," before diving for cover. By dawn on July 20th, the question wasn't whether there would be peace. It was whether anyone would still be alive to see it. The morning of July 20th dawned with a strange mixture of hope and confusion. Officially, the Organization of American States had announced that a ceasefire would begin at 10 a.m. Local radio stations in both countries carried the news, playing triumphant music and speeches about peace. In theory, this was the end of the football war. But out on the front lines, nobody seemed to have gotten the memo. Or if they did, they didn't believe it. Salvadoran troops, battered and low on supplies, heard rumors of a ceasefire but weren't sure if it was real. Some officers warned their men to stay on guard, insisting, "Until we get official orders, assume the war is still on." Across the lines, Honduran soldiers were hearing the exact same thing. The result, a chaotic morning of accidental firefights, panicked retreats, and tense standoffs where nobody knew whether to shoot or wave a white flag. One Honduran veteran later described it perfectly. Imagine playing a soccer match where the referee blows the whistle, but half the players keep running around kicking the ball anyway. By midday, sporadic fighting was still flaring across several key areas. The most intense clashes were near Nueva Ocotepeque, where Salvadoran forces were desperately trying to hold their positions against Honduran counterattacks. The Salvadorans were exhausted, their uniforms tattered and their ammunition nearly gone. In some units, soldiers were down to just a few rounds each. One commander even ordered his men to conserve bullets by firing only when absolutely certain of a hit. On the Honduran side, morale was high. The news of the ceasefire, combined with recent battlefield gains, made many soldiers feel like victory was finally within reach. They pushed hard, retaking the towns and capturing abandoned Salvadoran equipment. In one humorous incident, a group of Honduran troops stumbled upon a Salvadoran field kitchen and immediately stopped fighting long enough to gorge themselves on beans and rice before resuming their advance. In the skies, the last aerial duels of the war played out. Captain Fernando Soto Henriquez took to the air once more, engaging in what would be the final dogfight of his career. His target was a Salvadoran bomber making a desperate run against Honduran positions. With a few well-placed bursts, Soto brought the bomber down. When he landed, his ground crew greeted him like a rock star. One mechanic reportedly shouted, "That's it, the last goal is ours." Meanwhile, diplomats were frantically working the phones. The OAS sent urgent messages to both governments, begging them to enforce the ceasefire. Finally, by late afternoon, the fighting began to die down. Commanders on both sides ordered their troops to hold fire. Soldiers emerged cautiously from trenches, blinking in the sunlight like men waking from a nightmare. But the damage had already been done. In just 4 days of fighting, an estimated 2,000 people had been killed. Thousands more were wounded. Entire villages were burned or abandoned. The refugee crisis had reached staggering levels. More than 300,000 Salvadorans were now homeless, many of them fleeing across the border with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Historians still debate whether El Salvador's initial invasion achieved anything beyond pointless destruction. Some argue that their early successes gave them leverage in the post-war negotiations. Others believe the invasion was a catastrophic miscalculation that left the country weaker than before. One thing everyone agrees on is that the war left deep scars. Salvadoran families who had lived in Honduras for generations were uprooted overnight. Many would never return. Honduran border towns, meanwhile, were left in ruins for years afterward. Both nations viewed each other with suspicion and resentment. Back in the capitals, politicians spun the outcome to their advantage. El Salvador's government declared that their soldiers had fought heroically and achieved their objectives. Even though they had been forced to withdraw, Honduras proclaimed itself the victor, proudly pointing to the fact that Salvadoran troops had been pushed back across the border. It was a bizarre situation where both sides claimed to have won, even though everyone involved had clearly lost. As evening fell on July 20th, the battlefield grew quiet at last. Smoke rose from the ruins of towns. Drifting lazily into the twilight sky, soldiers sat in silence, too tired to speak, in one trench. A Salvadoran private reached into his pocket and pulled out a battered soccer ticket, the one he'd saved from that fateful World Cup qualifier weeks earlier. He stared at it for a moment, then tossed it into the fire. For him, and for thousands of others, the war was over, but the memory of how it started would haunt them for the rest of their lives. By July 21st, the guns had finally fallen silent, at least in most places. The official ceasefire was in effect, and for the first time in nearly a week, the borderlands weren't echoing with constant explosions and screaming engines. Smoke still hung in the air, drifting lazily over burned-out villages and abandoned trenches, but the overwhelming sound was now silence. Soldiers on both sides emerged cautiously from their positions. Some carried white rags tied to sticks. Others simply raised their empty hands and hoped for the best. In many areas, the ceasefire felt fragile, like a soccer match where the referee had blown the final whistle, but both teams were still glaring at each other, fists clenched. The Salvadoran army began its slow withdrawal back toward its own territory. This was no triumphant march. It was a retreat muddy, disorganized, and bitter. Soldiers stumbled along the roads, exhausted and starving. Many were barefoot by this point, their boots having literally fallen apart. In some columns, wounded men were carried on makeshift stretchers made from doors and tree branches. One Salvadoran officer later described the retreat as a parade of ghosts. It wasn't far off. The army that had charged into Honduras with fiery speeches and patriotic songs now returned home in near silence. Honduran forces reoccupied the towns they'd lost. The scenes they found were devastating. Burned houses, scorched fields, streets littered with debris and the occasional heartbreaking sign of abandoned life, a child's shoe, a broken guitar, a soccer ball blackened by fire. Civilians cautiously returned to their homes, only to find that home no longer existed. In some cases, entire villages had been wiped off the map. Refugees camped along roadsides, forming sprawling, desperate encampments. Aid organizations rushed to provide food and medical care, but they were overwhelmed. The political fallout began immediately. In El Salvador, the government insisted their troops had fought heroically and accomplished their mission. They claimed the invasion had been necessary to defend Salvadoran migrants and restore national dignity, behind closed doors. However, officials were scrambling to manage the economic disaster caused by the war. With so many refugees returning and so much farmland destroyed, the country faced a looming humanitarian crisis. Honduras declared victory with equal gusto. Their leaders framed the war as a successful defense of sovereignty, emphasizing that Salvadoran forces had been pushed back. But their economy, too, was in shambles. Infrastructure had been damaged, trade disrupted, and thousands of citizens were now displaced. Internationally, the war was seen as a bizarre cautionary tale. The world had watched in disbelief as two nations went to war over issues that were, on the surface, sparked by soccer. The final casualty number shocked everyone, around 2,000 dead, thousands more wounded, and more than 300,000 people displaced. Historians still debate the deeper causes of the football war. Some see it primarily as a conflict over land and migration, with soccer acting as the match that lit the fuse. Others argue that the games themselves, with their intense nationalism and media coverage, poured gasoline on long simmering tensions. Whatever the cause, the legacy of the war was lasting. For years, relations between El Salvador and Honduras remained icy, trade was disrupted, and border disputes continued to flare up periodically. Many of the displaced families never returned to their homes. One strange piece of trivia, the very soccer tournament that helped trigger the war continued after the ceasefire. Honduras and El Salvador were both disqualified from advancing, but their infamous matches became legend. To this day, fans and historians debate whether those games should be remembered for their sportsmanship or as a grim warning of what can happen when passion turns into violence. And so, the football war faded into history, leaving behind scars both visible and invisible. It was one of the shortest wars of the 20th century, yet its impact lasted for decades. The war is over now. The guns are silent, the soldiers have gone home, and the fields that once echoed with battle cries are quiet once more. Take a deep breath. Let the smoke and noise fade away in your mind. Imagine the hills and villages, no longer lit by fire, but by the soft glow of dawn. In the days after the fighting ended, life crept back slowly. Farmers returned to their fields. Though some found only ashes where crops once grew, children wandered through the ruins of their homes, trying to understand why everything felt different, quieter, emptier. The soldiers, too, carried their own burdens home. They brought back stories, some brave, some foolish, some too painful to tell. They left behind friends, neighbors, and memories of nights filled with fear and confusion. For the refugees, the journey was harder still. Many never saw their homes again. They built new lives in unfamiliar places, always carrying with them the shadow of what had been lost. And yet, time moved forward. The war became history, then a story, then a warning. Today, it lives on not just in books and documentaries, but in the lessons it left behind that pride can destroy, that anger can blind, and that even something as simple as a soccer game can ignite a storm. So as you rest now, let the noise of that brief, furious war drift away. Picture the final whistle blowing at last, the players walking off the field, the crowd dispersing into the night. The game is over, the war is done. You are safe, the story is finished. Sleep well, knowing that, for now at least, the world is a little quieter.